Hello, and welcome to The Excerpt. I'm Dana Taylor. It's been a busy few months in the world of federal pardons. It started on day one of the Trump administration with more than 1,500 people pardoned for their roles in the January 6th Capitol riot. And the pardons just keep coming. The past few weeks, we've seen a spate of controversial clemency grants, including a couple of reality TV stars who were found guilty of defrauding community banks out of tens of millions of dollars, a gang leader serving multiple life sentences, and a Virginia sheriff convicted of bribery in what prosecutors called a cash for badges scheme. The pardons are legal, but what are the ethical concerns here as President Donald Trump's list of pardons continues to grow? Here to dig into some of the details of the president's current pardon spree is former U.S. pardon attorney Liz Oyer. Thanks for joining me, Liz.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start off with full transparency here. You're suing the DOJ for your dismissal earlier this year. What's the background here? And can you please explain what the job of a U.S. pardon attorney is?
I was fired in March from my position as pardon attorney, which is a non political position within the Department of Justice that is entrusted with reviewing applications for clemency from individuals around the country who are seeking that relief from the president and making recommendations to the president about who presents a worthy case for clemency. The position of pardon attorney is one that historically has been filled by a career employee of the Department of Justice, not a political appointee, to ensure that that position is one that is neutral and objective and that the clemency process is not fully politicized. Nevertheless, I was fired very abruptly in March, and my firing violated a whole host of civil service protections that apply to career employees. So I am appealing my termination to the Merit Systems Protection Board, which is the agency that's entrusted with adjudicating those types of issues.
There were some surprising pardons recently. We can't address them all, but I do want to discuss a handful. Let's start with Larry Hoover, a Chicago gang leader serving multiple life sentences for charges including murder, extortion, and money laundering. Trump can pardon whoever he wants. Do you worry he's not getting the best research for each case to determine if clemency is warranted?
Well, the case of Larry Hoover is actually a very complex one. He has state convictions for an offense involving murder, and then he went on while in state prison to run a continuing criminal enterprise from the state prison, and he incurred additional federal convictions. So the federal convictions are the ones that were pardoned, not the state convictions. His sentence was commuted, and now he still has to deal with those state charges. But it is extremely unusual to grant a commutation of sentence to someone who goes on to commit a massive criminal offense while they're in prison. One of the things that's especially notable about Hoover's case is that he was serving his sentence at the federal supermax prison. It's called ADX. It's a notorious prison where people who present challenging conduct in prison and need ultra restrictive conditions of confinement are housed. So the fact that he was granted a commutation by President Trump is very unusual and suggests that not a lot of weight is being placed on conduct in prison in considering who is worthy of a commutation of sentence.
Many of these pardons are for people who owed significant sums of money in restitution for their crimes. Todd and Julie Chrysley, the reality TV stars, for example. What recourse do the people or entities who are due that money have, if any? And do you worry that Trump is granting clemency to people who don't show remorse?
What the president has done in terms of using the pardon power to wipe out financial obligations that are owed to victims of crimes is unprecedented. The Chrysleys are one example among many of individuals who were required under federal law to pay what's called restitution. That means essentially paying back victims of crimes. But the pardons have the effect of wiping out that obligation to repay the victims. And those include people who are out of pocket very substantial sums. So that's an extremely unusual use of the pardon power. And it's one that really does prejudice the interests of people who have been victimized by crimes.
And as I mentioned, former Virginia Sheriff Scott Jenkins at the top, he was convicted of receiving at least $75,000 in exchange for appointing North Virginia business executives as auxiliary deputies. He was scheduled to start a 10-year prison sentence the following day when the pardon came in. President Trump wrote on Truth Social that he and his family were, quote, dragged through hell by a corrupt and weaponized Biden DOJ, unquote. Do you worry that Trump is responding to personal, emotional appeals rather than legal research?
Trump does appear to be granting pardons to people in whom he sees something of his own story, something that he can relate to. But the case of Sheriff Jenkins was actually one that was a very straightforward case. He was caught on video accepting envelopes full of cash in exchange for bestowing badges upon people. So it's not a case where there was any doubt about his guilt. It is a case where the president decided to reward someone who was a political loyalist. And it's very unusual to see pardons of corrupt public officials in the way that Trump has been granting them. Sheriff Jenkins is actually one of, I believe, about eight public officials, elected officials who have committed crimes involving an abuse of their official office, who have received pardons from President Trump just in his second term alone.
Why do you think it's important to have an independent set of eyes researching cases?
What's so essential about the function that the Office of the Pardon Attorney has played historically is the vetting of candidates that they provide. The Department of Justice has a set of criteria that are very detailed and very rigorous that apply in every case before a recommendation is made to grant clemency. And in the interests of public safety, that vetting is taken very seriously. So individuals who are not vetted won't get through this process. The vetting is an important component of it. And the other really important role that the Office of the Pardon Attorney has historically played is accessibility, making sure that the clemency process is accessible to all, not just those who have political connections, which unfortunately appear to be the only types of people who are getting clemency under the current administration.
Paul Walzak, a former nursing home executive, also received a pardon. His mother recently attended a $1 million plate Mar-a-Lago fundraiser for Trump's super PAC. Do you worry the president will grant clemency in exchange for gifts or even bribes?
It appears that we're getting very close to that line. Individuals who are making large donations to the president or his causes are seeing those donations rewarded in the form of pardons. Walsack is one example of that, but not the only example. There's an individual named Trevor Milton who committed a massive fraud, defrauded his investors of over $600 million. And he made a campaign donation of $1.8 million to Trump and then got a pardon early in the administration. So it's becoming almost sort of a business transaction for people who are involved in white collar crime. They're making a calculation that I can pay X and then I can profit X times 100 on committing white collar crimes, which is not something that we should be encouraging in this manner. And it's not how the pardon process is supposed to work.
The president was asked a couple of weeks ago if he would consider pardoning P. Diddy, who's currently on trial for sex trafficking, racketeering, and transportation to engage in prostitution. In witness testimony, he's been described as violent and abusive. If this pardon were to happen, it would, of course, put an end to an emotional and taxing trial for his alleged victims. Is there any legal precedent for this?
It's very unusual to grant pardons to people who are the subject of ongoing cases, but that has not deterred this president. This president has undercut his own Justice Department multiple times by pulling the rug out from under prosecutions that they're actively pursuing. It would be very unusual to grant a pardon to somebody in this circumstance who's currently on trial, but the president does have the authority to do that if that's what he chooses. I will note that one of the things that the Department of Justice ordinarily does is solicit input from victims of crimes about how they would feel about a pardon. That step is being skipped by this current administration. The people who are victims of these crimes that are being pardoned are not being consulted for their input, which again is not how the process is supposed to work.
These recent clemencies came on the heels of the biggest blanket clemency of all time, and that was for the January 6th rioters, including those who assaulted police officers. As a former pardon attorney, what's the takeaway here for the American public when it comes to pardons for Trump loyalists, and what message does it send to the law officer community?
Well, that action, along with the other things this president have sent a very strong message that the pardon power is going to be used to reward political loyalists. He appointed a pardon attorney who essentially has said as much. After the pardon of that corrupt sheriff that you mentioned, Sheriff Jenkins, the new pardon attorney, Ed Martin, announced no MAGA left behind, which seemed to convey a view that MAGA supporters would be broadly considered for pardons if they have committed crimes. And certainly that's what the January 6th pardons reflect on an absolutely massive scale, that the president's supporters don't have to worry about committing crimes because they will be protected by pardons.
Liz, does the Constitution say anything about the appearance of a two-tiered system of justice?
The Constitution grants the president this unchecked power to grant pardons and commutations of sentence, and there really are no limits to it. But the framers who wrote this broad power into the Constitution intended that it would be used for mercy, that it would be used to correct excesses of the criminal justice system, not that it would be used to do special favors for people who have political connections or wealth. But that's exactly how it's being used now. The judge in the case of Paul Walsack that you mentioned actually said in sentencing Walsack to prison, I'm sending the message that wealth is not a get out of jail free card in this country. And literally days later, Trump granted Walsack a pardon, which just illustrates that, in fact, under Trump's system of justice, wealth can be and often is a get out of jail free card.
As you've said, the power of the pardon has been used for centuries to grant clemency to those the president feels are deserving of it. In your opinion, has the legitimacy of the pardon power been called into question?
Absolutely. The legitimacy of the pardon power has been called into question. I think that there are a lot of people in this country now who are watching what's happening and asking, why does this power even exist? It is a power that has a great deal of potential to be used for good. We saw it at its height under President Obama, who used it in a very principled and disciplined way to reduce sentences of people who were over incarcerated due to outdated mandatory minimums. And he did that in a way that was very fair and consistent across the board and did a lot of good. But the way it's been used more recently and what Trump is doing with it now is really raising legitimate questions about whether this power is a good thing.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights and for being on the excerpt, Liz.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for watching. I'm Dana Taylor. I'll see you next time.